Good noon, everyone. Welcome to another CLHO Colleague Circle. I was about to say morning, and I was like, no, it is definitely not still morning. Welcome. We're really excited to have you all here for a session on digitizing the newspapers of Connecticut. I'm Amherst Williams. I'm the Executive Director of CLHO, and I have with me here assisting me on all fronts, our new membership and programs manager, Emily Garfinkel. Emily, say hello.
Hi, everybody.
So before we get started today, we have with us three folks from the Connecticut Digital Newspaper Project at the Connecticut State Library: Gail Hurley, Nicole, Besseghir, and Newman. And they're going to share a presentation about the Connecticut Digital Newspaper Project and what's been going on at the State Library there. But before they get started, I wanted to hand things over to for just a moment to Scott Wands, Manager of Grants and Programs at Connecticut Humanities, because I know that many of you are here because you're interested in doing digitization projects, possibly thinking about newspapers and other periodicals in your collections, and the best practices for digitizing those. Perhaps because you got an operating support or other grant recently from Connecticut Humanities. So Scott wanted to just say a few words on that front. Scott?
Thank you, Amherst, and thanks to you and Emily for hosting another noontime chat on an issue like this, which is so important and very much appreciated by us all. So yes, we know some of you have gotten some money recently, whether it be operating support grants right before Christmas, or possibly a SHARP grant to do some specific collections work with funds that we got from the NEH. And even if you haven't gotten funds, there will be opportunities we'll talk more about at the end for potential work in this area. But it seemed like time with some of the questions we were getting here to make connections with our friends at the State Library and Gail and Nicole to let you know if you were interested in using some of the funds that you have or seeking out funds in the future to take your newspaper collections and make them more accessible online. There is work that's already been done in this area. There are tools and trainings and resources the State Library has, and we wanted to make sure that you knew about those before you dove in too deep and were duplicating things that had already been digitized before, or were doing things that you might find after the fact you wished you had done differently at the outset. So that's the whole goal here. And I'm not going to say more at this point, but like I said, happy to answer more specific questions about grants and funding at the end or offline afterwards. And with that, I'll turn it back to Amherst.
Great, thanks, Scott. And thanks again to Connecticut Humanities for all the support that you provided the cultural sector now and are continuing to do so in the future. So without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to our folks from the Connecticut Digital Newspaper Project at the Connecticut State Library. We have with us today Gail Hurley, who's the co-director, Nicole Besseghir, who's the project coordinator, and Newman, the other co-director of the Connecticut Digital Newspaper Project. I believe they're going to speak in that order. Nicole's got some slides she's going to share with us. Without further ado, I'll hand things over to Gail. Go ahead. Oh, I just want to mention that if you have any questions as we go, you can feel free to pop those in the chat, and we'll have a general Q&A after they finish their presentation. Thanks. Gail?
Okay, thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. And again, I want to thank also CLHO for having us here today, and thank Connecticut Humanities for working with us to get this program going. So I've been involved with newspaper digitization efforts probably for more than 10 years now, maybe closer to 12. And before we get into the heart of the program, I wanted just to give you a brief overview of the projects in the state, because it can be a little bit confusing as to which program does what. So I am going to start with the Connecticut Digital Newspaper Project, which Anna, Nicole, and I are involved in. So this is a grant-funded project of the National Endowment for the Humanities to digitize historic newspapers in all 50 states and U.S. territories. And then the digitized newspapers are made freely available to everyone through the Library of Congress's database called Chronicling America. So the NEH awards the grants in 2-year cycles to digitize 100,000 pages of newspapers. So it sounds like a lot, but when you really start looking at things, it doesn't go as far as we'd like to. But we were fortunate to receive a 2-year grant for the 2013 to 2015 cycle. So since then, we've been, again, very, very happy to have received now 5 2-year grants. So we're in that 5th cycle right now. And the grants to date totaling over $1 million. And we have more than 400,000 pages of newspapers up on Chronicling America now for you to be able to access. For this project, we need to work within certain date parameters and other guidelines from the NEH to select the newspapers that we do digitize for each of our grant rounds. And we'll be hopefully announcing what titles we're going to be doing in this 5th round, possibly by the end of the month or early May. So can keep an eye out for what we're planning to do next. Next, I'm going to go to the Newspapers of Connecticut project. This was a project of an offshoot of a project rather called the Treasures of Connecticut Libraries, which some of you may remember. It was a project of the State Library and Library Connection Network, and it started, I want to say it's like 2008 or 10. It's been a while since that kicked off. This was a project where we were helping digitize things like photographs, postcards, etc. But we always got asked the question about newspapers. And newspapers was really its own thing, which we definitely found out. So the Treasures collection was hosted on the Connecticut State Library's website on our Content DM platform. So while we were doing the treasures and now looking at possibly doing the newspapers, in 2011, in conjunction with the Civil War commemoration efforts being done in the state, we decided to work on a pilot project with Library Connection to try to digitize some newspapers to go along with this Civil War work. So we ended up digitizing short runs of Civil War era newspapers from all around the state to create, and this was from microfilm that the state library had readily available to us. And we created a collection called Newspapers of Connecticut that again also lived on our Content DM platform at the state library. And again, that's free access to all for that collection. So then here's where you all come into this project. So since we have this Content DM platform, we offered to host any newspapers that were already digitized by local libraries or historical societies in this Newspapers of Connecticut collection. And we worked with, for example, Norwalk Public Library, Enfield Public Library, and some others to put their newspapers up on this Newspapers of Connecticut collection we had. So what they would do was they shared the files that they got from digitizing their papers and any metadata, and then we worked with those files to upload them into Content DM. So one of the things with these local projects is a lot of the libraries we talked to really didn't have platforms to put their papers onto once they actually had the digitized files. So this was a nice way of being able to host these. So some years after that, we had the arrival of our Connecticut Digital Archive in the state, hosted at UConn. So we have since migrated all of our newspapers that were on our Content DM platform. We did migrate into the CTDA. So now we still have the arrangement. If you have digitized a newspaper, we can work with you and the CTDA to get your files uploaded directly into the CTDA. They offer training if you have staff that wants to do it themselves, or we can work with the staff, and as time permits, our staff can help to upload the content into the CTDA. In each of our organizations, we have like a short agreement form that we would ask to be filled out, and then we could take it from there to work on. But it's just, we'd love to continue to grow these newspaper collections. They're great primary source materials. in the state for researchers, students, et cetera, to use. So we'd love to keep it going. So before I actually just turn this over to Nicole next, if you don't mind, if any of you have already done a newspaper project or thinking about one, if you wouldn't mind just putting something in chat at some point during the program today, I'd love to see what kind of efforts are being considered out there. So thank you.
All right, thanks, Gail. So as Gail mentioned, I'm the project coordinator. I'm Nicole Besseghir, the project coordinator for the Connecticut Digital Newspaper Project. And so now myself and then Anna Newman, our other co-director, we're going to talk about kind of some of the stages that you'll go through in newspaper digitization, the things you can expect to encounter, things you need to think about when you're undertaking these projects. And a lot of our knowledge of these subject areas has come from working with the Connecticut Digital Newspaper Project and then also Newspapers of Connecticut and the library's other internal digitization projects. So that's where our knowledge comes from. This is, you know, like Scott says, you don't want to reinvent the wheel with this. We're happy to share our knowledge and our resources, but also not to say that there's only one way of doing things either. These are just kind of what you want to consider and how you might want to approach it. You know, this is a short talk today, so I'm going to be very general, very high level. A lot of these are pretty complex subjects, so, you know, feel free to let us know if you have more in-depth questions. And if it has to be something discussed offline after the presentation, that's fine as well, because it can get pretty into the weeds with some of these topics. But really what we want to do today is just give you an idea of you know, what's involved in newspaper digitization projects and how you might start thinking about planning, mapping out your own project if that's what you're looking to do. So first I'm going to talk about title selection, selecting your newspapers that you might want to digitize. And there are a few aspects of that you'll consider. So first, looking at the historical and informational value of your papers. So you might be in a situation where you have a lot of newspapers you're trying to choose from for digitization and you can't do them all. Maybe initially you can't do them all, or you need to do it in phases, or you're kind of looking to do a small pilot project. So you're going to want to look at ways to maybe narrow your title list down. You can look at things like what's your longest running title or your most significant titles? You know, what was considered the authoritative paper in your town or area? What were the most popular titles? What had the widest readership, circulation numbers? What is referred to the most when people talk about a newspaper for your town? And then also consider research use and value. Your most significant paper might not be the one that is most heavily used for research, because maybe people already know what's in there. Maybe they're going to kind of your paper, your smaller paper that had a different viewpoint or presented things differently than your major paper. So take that into consideration as well. And then also your older titles, those can sometimes be your most vulnerable and most in need of digital preservation, just to keep them accessible. So things to consider. After you're looking at your informational and historical value of your titles, you also want to think about format. Are you going to digitize from your paper originals or from microfilm? And there are pros and cons to both. For Connecticut Digital Newspaper Project, like Gail said, we're bound to very specific guidelines and specifications from NEH and the Library of Congress. We pretty much have to digitize from microfilm. Only in specialized cases would we not. So, but when you're doing the project yourself, not part of a grant project like this one, you might be able to choose between the two. One may work better than the other for you. So you need to just think about some differences. Paper can be more expensive to digitize. Typically, we found that vendors will quote you a higher price for digitizing from paper originals for a few reasons. They take more work. They can be more challenging logistically because if they're fragile, if they need to be handled specially, if they're bound and potentially need to be unbound, that's all the extra work that goes into using your paper originals. So something to consider. And if, if your budget is going to be tight, that's another thing to consider as well. You may not be able to get as many pages, as many issues done if you're working from your paper originals. Microfilm is typically less expensive to digitize because it's easier. They load it into these large scanners and just send it on its way. And on the vendor end, it doesn't, there's specialized handling for microfilm, but not in the way that you have with a paper document. It does require different equipment. It does require equipment to look at your microfilm. If you're looking at your service copies, the research copies that you have at your library or organization, obviously you need a microfilm reader. And if you're examining the print negatives, which I'll talk about in just a second, before they get sent off for digitization, you need special equipment for that as well. But it's not actually, that's not totally necessary because your vendor can do that work as well, and typically includes that in their pricing. So just something to think about, paper versus film, when you're making your selections as well. What do you have available on paper? What's available on film? How's that going to affect your cost? Another aspect of your title selection is acquisition. If you're using microfilm, the standard is to typically duplicate from what's called the print negative. So with microfilm, the very first copy that was made of the microfilm, literally what came out of the camera when they microfilmed the newspaper, is called the master or camera negative. Your print negative is going to be the second generation copy of that original negative. The print negative is typically standard to use for scanning, for digitization. Then the copy that, in those, like in the name, negative, so they're a negative image. The copy that you have at your organization or at your local library is a positive, and typically called the service copy. You might call it the use copy, the research copy. That's going to be a positive image. It's possible to use a service copy for scanning. It's not impossible, but your scanned images are going to look a lot better likely from your print negatives for a couple of reasons. One, those are typically considered preservation copies, so they're not in use. They're not being put into microfilm readers. They're not going to have wear and tear. And your service copies they're going to get used, they're going to be beat up. So something to think about. You would need to locate print negatives and then obtain, you might need to borrow them if you're not the owner of those. If you're using film, regardless if you're using paper copies or microfilm, as part of the acquisition, you want to make sure you've got all the known copies of the paper. So you'll need to go through, do a little inventory of either type, either review your service copies or go through your paper copies and make sure all the issues here do we have any gaps? And is that because it wasn't published sometimes, the paper wasn't published sometimes, or is it because we're missing? So just, you want to be aware of those when you're doing your title selection. And then lastly, is you want to look at your film quality when you're doing title selection. And like, this is, I think, pretty obvious, goes without saying, the better the quality of the microfilm, the better the scans. Like I said, it's default to kind of use print negatives, but it's not out of the question to use your service copies. Negatives tend to scan better. They provide a cleaner image. There's less what they call noise on the film than on a positive copy. But if you only have access to the service copies, that's what you have. And if they're in decent shape, I wouldn't say I'm not going to do this title just because we only have service copies. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't scan it. It doesn't mean it's not a candidate. You should definitely consider it. So you want to think about the quality of the film, and you want to keep in mind any older microfilm is pre 70s, 80s, 1970s, 1980s is likely acetate and probably deteriorating at this point unless it's been in super cold storage for all these years. Microfilm or acetate microfilm starts to break down pretty easily, and you can tell your film is acetate if you open it and you have a vinegar smell. And both your negatives and your positives can be acetate. Acetate films really started to fall out of use in the 70s. By the 80s, we had really had more standards for microfilming, and it was really recommended don't use acetate. So that's really when you start to see a lot less of it. And also keep in mind, those older films are likely acetate, and they were likely, those newspapers were filmed before we had those standards for microfilming. So you're not gonna always have great quality to the filming itself. Maybe a lot of crooked pages, some blurriness, poor lighting. Again, that doesn't mean that you have to cross those titles, that film, off your list. It's just something you want to be aware of when you're making your title selection. So if you're, you're down to a few titles that you're considering, and you're like, you know what, this film is newer, it has better quality images on it, you might want to go with that title to start with, to get your feet wet for your pilot, and then wait until you're a little bit more experienced and seasoned to do those like slightly harder reels. Also, when you have acetate film, if it is severely deteriorating, it's going to be very fragile, and you're only going to have so many more times to put that film through equipment. So you'll need to warn your vendors that it's acetate film. They will typically, with acetate film, they don't put it through their fastest feeding scanners, but there's still a chance it could break during scanning. So you could be, but that's okay. That, again, that shouldn't be a reason that you say, oh my gosh, we can't do this title, because if the film is in that poor shape, you want to preserve the newspaper some other way so that it can still be accessible. So just because once your masters and your print negatives start to deteriorate, you can't make any more service copies, because you also make additional research copies from your masters and print negatives. So if those are in bad shape, you're going to be limited to making more microfilm of the paper as well. So something to think about, just warn your vendor so that they know they'll treat it with a little bit more care. I mean, they treat the microphone with care in general, but they're extra gentle with it when they know it's acetate, and they're prepared. And also you're prepared in case your film breaks. So those are just some aspects of selecting your titles, selecting, the paper, the newspapers are going to do, whether it's originals or film, that you'll want to think about. Obviously, all of these we could talk about even more, but like I said, we're being a little bit brief today. Another factor that you're going to look at after, kind of in conjunction with choosing your titles, but you might do some of this work after you've made your title selection, is copyright. So newspaper titles that are published after 1926 are not necessarily in the public domain. Right now, public domain goes up to 1926, so they could still be under copyright. So you might want to check the copyright status of those papers before you digitize. Depending on what platform, if you're going to, take part in Newspapers of Connecticut, you'll be using CTDA, but if you're using another platform, you also need to know, are you able to post content that's under copyright, which on CTDA you are. There just has to be a disclaimer. Others can speak more to that. For our project, for Connecticut Digital Newspaper Project, the Library of Congress does not allow us to post anything that is still under copyright. So we do a lot of copyright legwork as part of our project. You may not need to do this much work. It's all about how much risk your organization is comfortable with taking. We strongly recommend you do your due diligence, and that you are not even paying attention to copyright. We recommend considering it. But there is a lot of work being done in the research library community about, okay, how strong is newspaper copyright at this point for titles that are at this point 100 years old, 80 years old. So there's a lot. We have resources. We're going to share a link to a LibGuide at the end, and it'll also go out in the follow-up email to a LibGuide that we have on the State Library website. And it has a lot of stuff you can read about the copyright research that's been done for newspapers. So you can look over all that and kind of make, a best judgment for your organization. But if you do decide that you're going to look into copyright, you need to, 1926 is your cutoff, and you have to look at, there are two different aspects to it. The copyright of the newspaper title, was it registered? Was it renewed? If the newspaper was registered somewhere in the masthead, the header, or where they list the publisher information for the newspaper, there'll be a copyright symbol or notice that gives you the first clue. Was this registered? So then you can go look it up in the catalog of copyright entries and find the registration. and also look to see if it was renewed. If a paper that was published before 1978 does not have any sort of copyright notice, no symbol, no statement anywhere in the masthead, publishing information, then it's considered public domain. So you're good to go with that. But aside from the copyright of the newspaper title itself, there's also third-party content in newspapers, such as advertisements, comics, syndicated columns or articles that they may have bought from newspaper services, serial stories. Those could all have had their own copyright. So just because the newspaper title itself is clear of copyright doesn't mean that those items are. So that's where you have to decide how much are you going to investigate, how much time are you going to invest, because it is a little bit more time consuming to look up the third-party content. And this is a lengthy process that I could talk about for a very long time, but we will not go into that today because we don't have the time for that. But just know those are two things you're going to need to consider. If you're looking at, if you find a copyright symbol or statement on your titles, you're going to need to check every year past 1926 to see if it was registered and renewed. And then for your third-party content, you'll want to consider, are you going to check that as well? We use a sampling method for that. We don't check every single issue, every single item. That's something where we'd be happy to talk about when we have a longer session with folks. Again, you don't have to do it the way we do it. We follow kind of recommendations from the Library of Congress because we are beholden to their rules, but there are lots of different ways you could do it. You could come up with a process that works for your organization. You just have to decide what risk also works for your organization. So just something to think about the copyright, because I know there's a lot of interest in 20th century titles right now. So that's where you need to think about copyright. And the next kind of big aspect of this kind of what we call the production phase of newspaper digitization projects is working with your vendors. And there are several factors that you're going to think about when you're working with your vendors. First, you want to make sure that your vendor can scan to the specifications that you want. So the specifications that I have listed here, these are what we follow. They come from Library of Congress. These are like the top of the standard for newspaper digitization specifications. And we highly recommend trying to meet these specifications because it gives you a great scan that's super usable. Even when you're scanning from that film that isn't so great, if you're using these specs, your scans are going to come out nice. We have scanned from film that's not perfect and have lovely scans. If any of you have looked at the Litchfield Enquirer, I think I saw Linda Hawking here. We scanned that in our last cycle, and that film is not perfect by any means. Still usable. The scans are great. It's great to look at that paper. It turned out really well. So for your microfilm, the specs are pretty similar for microfilm and originals. For both of them, you want a TIFF 6.0 uncompressed, representing the original size of the page. 8-bit grayscale. If your originals had any sort of color in them, then you want to consider 24-bit color. But definitely you want 8-bit grayscale. Even when you're working from black and white image, you don't want it scanned in black and white. You want the grayscale because that leads for the scans really turn out better if you use grayscale. And then you're going to look at your 300 to 400 DPI. And so when you're looking at DPI, if your original text is really small, you might go to the higher end of DPI so that that allows you to zoom in and have more clarity as you zoom in. So things to keep in mind. You basically just want to make sure that your vendor is capable of meeting these specifications. For both formats, you want to make sure they can provide you with OCR, optical character recognition, for every page scanned, so that all your text is searchable. That's what allows you to search your text. You don't want them altering the TIFFs except for some slight deskewing, which is like straightening. So if your page was really crooked, they can straighten it a little bit. But ultimately, you have to remember digitization is a form of preservation. So you're not looking to wildly change the product, the final product. You want it to be representative of the original. So if the original was crooked or not perfect in some way, you can have a little of that showing. You just need it to be readable in the scan. And really the de-skewing is so your OCR works well. And you also just want them to crop the images to the edge of the pages. You don't want it right up to the text or too far out. You want it right at the page edge. So those are specs that you want to make sure your vendor can follow when you start talking to vendors. And then obviously pricing is super important. You're going to probably talk to multiple vendors to get estimates and quotes. You may see some wildly different pricing. So then you have to kind of review their quotes and say, okay, why are these differences? Is it because some vendors are looking at using lower specifications? And that's the case where you have to decide, okay, are we so limited in our budget that we're unfortunately going to have to go with lower specifications? That happens. You can't always do the best of the best. That's not practical for everyone. But you have to weigh that. Is that why there are some vendors bundle services? And so you have to say, okay, is it because this vendor's offering, maybe the shipping costs for microfilm is included in their pricing, and so they're a little bit higher? Or this vendor, the price per scan is lower because other parts of their service, they're doing like a la carte and doing a separate charge for that. So just pay attention to those sort of things when you're looking at your pricing. And you also want to make sure in their pricing that and this really goes into your contract, which we have more information on our LibGuide about. But if anything needs to be redone, if you're not happy with any work, make sure that's covered by what you're paying, that they're not going to charge you extra to redo work. They shouldn't be charging you. If something is not coming out right, then they should be redoing that for the price that you're already paying. And then you also want to ask the vendor for references and or examples of their work. So do they have any clients willing to give a reference, or can they at least share the name of past clients? Can you see examples of previous work they've done? Ideally newspaper digitization, but if they don't have newspapers, what other textual archival material? Photos are not a great comparison because photo digitization is very different than textual. So make sure they're showing you some sort of textual digitization, other archival materials, manuscripts, or, anything like that. And then you also want to talk to them about their workflows. So what order do they complete the task in, and what's involved in the different steps of their work process? And this is just not for you to micromanage them, but for you to know how they're handling a project, what the steps are, and just to have a better idea of how the whole process is going to work so that you're knowledgeable about what's going on. And then you want to ask how they're going to be handling your materials. Making sure that they're following, best practice and handling everything well, how they're going to transport things. Are they going to have you ship materials to them? Or are they going to come pick them up? That sort of thing. How are they going to store the materials when they have them? What kind of storage do they have? How are they keeping them secure? Those are the sort of questions you can ask them. You also want to talk about what prep work you might need to do before they even come to get the materials, or before you ship materials, so that you can prepare for that as well. And then another aspect is communication. Just how are they communicating with you throughout the project? What do they do to keep things on schedule if you have like a really set schedule you need to follow? But communication is really important. Makes all the difference, if your vendor is very communicative. So another aspect that you might want to ask them about is, which kind of goes in with workflow, is the location of the work. Are they completing it on site at your facility? It's sometimes common if you've got a vendor digitizing an original that maybe they come do some of that work on site if possible. If that's something you're interested in, you could ask about that. If you're using microfilm, it's almost 100% likely it's going to go to their facility, but you can ask them, where is your facility located? Because sometimes vendors who are scanning microfilm actually do the scanning outside of the country. So you might want to ask about that, just in case you have any reservations about your microfilm traveling overseas. Not because there's any problem with it being somewhere else, but shipping can be hard on material. So just something to consider. And, so that's another thing to consider. And then lastly, you want to ask about delivery methods. How are they going to deliver the data to you? Are they going to want to send it via FTP, transfer it, which means transferring it over the internet to you, or are they going to send on an external hard drive? And this is important so that you can keep your technology needs and capabilities in mind, and that you can communicate those to you. FTP transfers take, you need good internet speed for that. You also need a computer that can handle that. And if it's just not feasible, and they can take a long time, if that's not feasible for you, then you need to go to the vendor up front and say, we need stuff on external hard drives. Now, you will likely provide those hard drives, but you'll know that up front because you'll be thinking about that that's something you need to discuss with your vendor. So just knowing how the data is going to get to you and making sure that you think about that beforehand and communicate your technology needs and capabilities to your vendor, because they're flexible, they'll work with you. And that's important. So these are all factors to consider. Again, you could talk about all of these much more at length, but we're being slightly brief today. But next, I'm going to hand it off to Anna, who's going to tell you more about what you do with those files once you have them.
Great, thank you, Nicole. So I noticed, as all the great comments coming in from people who are thinking about newspaper projects, that one of the concerns that they have is about hosting. Where do you host your files? So I'm going to be talking about how you can make your digitized newspapers publicly accessible. I think most people attending here today may already be members of the Connecticut Digital Archive or aware of the CTDA, which is the digital preservation repository that is run out of UConn. And I saw that Greg Claudy, who's the director of the CTDA, has joined us here today. And if you have questions about joining the CTDA, using the CTDA to make your digitized newspapers publicly accessible, and then also preserved for the long term, I think he can probably address those questions in the Q&A at the end of this session. We really encourage the use of the CTDA as a platform for accessing and storing your digitized newspapers. As Gail had mentioned earlier, we do have a Newspapers of Connecticut collection up on the CTDA. So this includes titles that have been digitized by the state library, by a bunch of other institutions in the state. All of those newspapers are full text searchable. You can browse the issues by date. You can also download copies of the newspaper pages themselves. And also, as Gail mentioned, through our Newspapers of Connecticut program at the state library, if you are concerned about maybe not having the resources or the staff time to put those files, those newspapers into the CTDA, we can offer assistance doing that as well. So you can contact us if you would like to know more about that or get more information. And could I have the next slide, Nicole? Thank you. So I just wanted to very briefly touch on some other options that have kind of come up in our conversations with institutions who are interested in newspaper digitization projects, and just sort of go through some of those. So one option is the vendor that you work with may provide online hosting as a service that costs an additional fee. One example that I think people might be familiar with is Advantage Archives, which was formerly Advantage Preservation. So obviously the disadvantage here is that you're having to pay that extra fee to host your files somewhere. With Advantage Archives as well, they are very open about the fact that they digitize for access. They do not digitize for preservation. So that means that their technical specifications they use are not up to the standards that Nicole just described. So keep that in mind, that what they're doing, they're not really creating sort of an accurate digital representation, and therefore the quality of the newspapers that are digitized is not going to be as high as you might get if you go with other vendors and take on your project in a different way. Another option that I know other people have been interested in is sort of hosting the newspaper files on your own website, so having some kind of custom solution. The advantage here is that your community is very easily able to find your newspapers. They're on their site. You're probably going to your site for to get other kinds of research done. However, we kind of strongly recommend that you do not do this. It does require a lot of technical infrastructure to be able to support something like that long term, particularly because you're probably looking at having a lot of files with really huge file sizes. And it's also often not a sustainable solution. We've heard of at least one case of an institution who set up their own custom website to host their newspapers, and then they found out that they were losing their hosting and had to very quickly come up with an alternative. So we would hate to see anybody kind of caught in that really difficult situation. And then lastly, we do get some questions about newspapers.com. So they have kind of a different model. That newspapers.com is the commercial newspaper database. It's affiliated with ancestry.com. So what they do is they will digitize your newspapers, they will index them, and they will host them in their database at no cost to you, besides the cost of shipping the microfilm out to their facility in Utah for the digitization. So obviously this is very appealing because you don't really have to pay very much for this. But the real downside here is that there is no public access. Users will need a subscription to newspapers.com in order to access their digitized newspapers. They might also give you some sort of like limited on-site access. While users are at your institution, they could be able to browse the newspapers on your computers. So this isn't public access, and that I think everyone here today is really interested in public access. We want to make the newspapers of Connecticut as available to as many people as possible. We want to really increase that discoverability and that availability. So with newspapers.com, there's a huge barrier to access for a lot of people. And there are also a lot of limitations with newspapers.com and how you can actually use those digital files. So they might give you a copy of them, but you're limited into what you can actually do with them. And if you don't follow the terms of your agreement, you might incur financial penalties as a result. So that is definitely something to keep in mind. We wanted to kind of present that as an option because it is available and we do get questions about it, but just keep in mind that those are some definite disadvantages. And then the last note here, I just wanted to make a note that you do, even if you are planning to host your files on one of these platforms like the CTDA, where you know that they are going to be digitally preserved, think about data storage at the beginning of your project, because in that period of time between when you get a hard drive from a vendor and when you have the files up in the CTDA, you want to make sure they're backed up so you don't lose all of that work. And then just the final piece before we get into the Q&A session, I just wanted to talk about a few funding options. Obviously, Scott mentioned at the beginning of this session that if you've received operating support from Connecticut Humanities, that's definitely an option. We have done a lot of research into trying to find different specific newspaper digitization grants. There aren't really any out there besides the National Digital Newspaper Program grant that we receive from the National Endowment for the Humanities for the Connecticut Digital Newspaper Project. And I think, as Gail and Nicole sort of both mentioned, that due to the specifications of that grant, we can't sort of grant money to, we can't fund individual newspaper digitization projects. We have very specific parameters. So you could look for sort of broader grants for digitization projects, likely part of sort of larger projects that have public engagement or digital humanities components to them. And then also you could look for local funding. So these, I put some examples on this slide of things that we know have worked for certain institutions or that institutions have thought about doing. So looking to your library board or your town for funding, particularly if you have a local town official who's really interested in historic newspapers, that's always a plus. You could also look to apply to local foundations for funding, work with your friends of library groups, or even solicit individual donations, particularly if you have any individuals in your communities who are particularly connected to a local paper, a former publisher, someone who worked there, you know, someone who has that kind of connection and might be willing to help to donate. So with that, we just have one more slide that has our contact information about who to kind of reach out to for questions, as well as those links that Nicole mentioned earlier.
This will get sent out in a follow-up email. So basically, any questions, microfilm, title selection, copyright, working for vendors, you can feel free to email me. If you're wanting to learn more about joining Newspapers of Connecticut, you're going to email Gail and Anna, and then Anna can help you with questions on access options, preservation for digitized newspapers. And then, like I said, we have a LibGuide on the State Library website that goes over briefly some of the things we've talked about today, but it's got some good links to like other resources, especially for copyright, if you want to read all about newspaper copyright. And then also the Newspapers of Connecticut collection on CTDA, you can check that out to see what's already there. And then of course you can also find Connecticut, I did not put a link here, to Connecticut Digital Newspaper Project. Our papers are all up on Chronicling America, and when you get to the main site, you just easily filter for Connecticut newspapers and you can see everything we've put in there, just if you want to see what papers are up. So now we'll go to Q&A.
Great, thank you so much. If you could stop your screen share, Nicola, it would be great, and then we can take a look at everybody here. Wonderful. There have been a number of questions and kind of comments coming in, and I wanted to sort of group, I've been trying to like taking some notes and thinking about the sort of areas that these have been covered. So I want to highlight a few questions that have come in. There was one question about thinking about working with papers that are basically still operating. I forget exactly who it was, but someone was talking about a local paper where they've been working to digitize it, but the ownership of the paper keeps changing, as is the case with a lot of print publications at this moment in time. Do you have any? I mean, and I assume this relates to the intellectual property issue around anything sort of post 26 or without copyright post 1970, whatever date you had said that was. So I was wondering if you had any tips for people who are trying to cooperate with newspapers that are still being actively published.
Well, basically, if it's not in public domain, so if it's pre-1978 and has a copyright mark symbol and you find it in the catalog of copyright entries, they own the copyright to that paper. So you're taking significant risk if you were to digitize it and put it online. We would never be able to do that. That's not to say that you can't do that. If you've had amicable conversations with them previously, I mean, that could go a long way. If they haven't been responsive and haven't been really interested in digitization, that could be something you might want to steer clear of. But yeah, if it's under copyright, though, we wouldn't touch it. It's not to say there are institutions, though, that have digitized content that's under copyright. It's a matter of your risk and what you think the likelihood is, that because the biggest thing that they could do is ask you to take it down. I mean, they could. I don't think anybody would sue over that. Gail might have a different opinion, but I think that the worst that could happen is they could say, can you take that down? And then you've done all that work, you've paid for that digitization, and now that stuff's not really usable. So that's just something to think about. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, so that was Claire from Bristol. Apologies, I had to go back in the chat. Diane Seba had a question about basically like if you have newspapers that you're not interested in holding on to anymore, what are some good ways of thinking about best practices around deaccessioning those? Like, finding someone else to take them in. Where might you look to get ideas about whether this is something that needs to continue to be preserved at a repository or not? Do you have suggestions in that vein?
So one thing to look at is, are you the only repository that holds that paper? If that's really the only place that paper is being preserved, that's something to consider, because once you deaccession your copies and essentially probably recycle or destroy them, that paper could be lost. Has the paper been microfilmed? If it's been microfilmed and the state library has at least service copies, you could look at that. You can consider if you're like a local library or historical society and you just can't manage, if you're talking about physical papers or even the microfilm, sometimes some places, I know microfilm gets hard to care for after a while. Look at your bigger repositories around you. So check your universities, check with the state library. Anna's probably like, don't bring us microfilm, but no, seriously though, if places are needing to free up space or can no longer care for these items, it's best to check with larger repositories, universities, larger libraries, more regional organizations like us, and see if they're interested in taking in, especially if you hold the only copy of those papers. So first check and see if they're anywhere else, if they exist anywhere else, either in print or microfilm, and then go from there. If you have the only existing copies, definitely try to transfer those somewhere so that it's not completely lost. And if digitization is an option that some places take, if they don't want to keep the physical anymore, the microfilm, they digitize so that they can then deaccession those items that they just can't afford or have the staff time or resources to maintain anymore. So that could be an option as well.
And just to quickly add on to what Nicole said, the state library, as she said, the state library does collect Connecticut newspapers. So you are always welcome to email me if you have newspapers that you're looking to deaccession, and I can talk to our head of collection services and see if we already hold it or if it's a gap. If it's filling a gap, I think we're always welcome to take that.
Great, thanks. That's so helpful. I mean, I know that organizations are always, struggling with these issues around like what we've got and what we should be stewarding and what might be better to, go somewhere else. This doesn't really fit with the mission of the organization if it's a newspaper from some random place. Thinking structures for how to think about approaching that question in a thoughtful way that doesn't, just get rid of something forever that might actually be important or someone might else want is really useful, I think. Claire also had a question about, I need to go back to this, about where you find those print negatives. If you have the access copies, but you want to find the print negatives that you were talking about, Nicole, what are some resources for locating the source of those if you just have the, rolls of microfilm?
So if you have a service copy, the research use copy of the microfilm, and it was filmed starting more in the 80s, 90s, it might have a title slide at the beginning telling you who filmed that, what company, and then like what library owned the newspapers or loaned the newspapers for filming. So the library or institution, it may not have been a library, that loaned the paper to be filmed is technically who owns the masters. So you can start by checking your service copies and seeing if they have that notice at the beginning. If you don't have that there, if there's a company name present on the film, you could check with them. A lot of those companies that did microfilming are out of business now. So another place, the one company that's still in business and actually holds a lot of film is New England Micrographics. So you can check with them to see if they hold the film, but they will not loan you any film without permission from who actually owns it, but they should be able to tell you who the owner of the film is. You can also, the Library of Congress has oh my gosh, they just changed the name. Let me make sure I get it right. It's the U.S. Directory of Newspapers now, right, Anna? Is that what it's called now? Yes, so the Library of Congress has the U.S. Directory of Newspapers, and you can search papers in there and it'll tell you who holds copies in both originals and microfilm, and it will differentiate between service copies and masters. So whoever holds the masters there, you can contact them and say, do you have print negatives? Are you willing to loan the print negatives as well? So there are a few different avenues. And if you need assistance with navigating that, that's something you could email us with and we can kind of point you in the right direction. But typically start with the film itself, see what information is there, whether it be the company who filmed it, what institutions paid for the filming. If it was something that was filmed by the Connecticut Newspaper Project, which was the grant project that preceded Connecticut Digital Newspaper Project, then the state library is aware typically of where those masters are. But there's a lot of film that was not done as part of that project. It was done earlier. So that's where you want to look up maybe in Library of Congress, their directory, and see who's holding microfilm copies. And if you get stuck, reach out to us, because we've had to investigate, kind of track down masters for a lot of titles. So we can see if there's anything hiding anywhere.
Great. I mean, that leads to another question that has come up, which is kind of like, if you're making these decisions, about, titles to digitize, what, beyond Connecticut, the Connecticut Newspaper Project, are there other places that people should be looking to find out, like, have these titles already been digitized? Where do you kind of go to figure out what's out there and what the landscape looks like as you're making these decisions about what might be the best candidates for digitization at your institution?
I think Gail would agree that besides our project and Newspapers of Connecticut, where you're going to need to look is your local places, right, Gail? At local organizations for Connecticut papers. There are no other large repositories of digitized Connecticut newspapers, right?
Correct. As far as we know, yeah, we usually will typically, hopefully within like the same town, like the library or historical society or museums are talking to each other or know what each other has. So just to make sure another one is not already thinking of doing the same thing or did it. But then otherwise, like we have, like Nicole mentioned, on each of our project websites on the newspapers of Connecticut collection on CTDA, you will see the list of titles. On our Connecticut Digital Newspaper Grant Project website, you will again see what titles we have done. And then you can always, like I said, if you're thinking of it, check with us, because like right now, like I mentioned, we're going to be announcing which titles we're going to be doing next for the grant, and probably by the end of the month. So one of yours might be in there. So just, I would, you could check with us first to say, hey, is this, already being included?
Great. Yeah, and there was a related question from Jake. What's the best way to review all the newspapers that are on microfilm at the state library and in those newspaper projects? Is the answer basically the same?
Anna, what would you say is the best way to review?
The best way to find out about our masters. So I put the link about the directory of US newspapers and American libraries. This is the Library of Congress database. So if you look up a title of a newspaper you're interested in, and there's like a section at the bottom that says libraries that have this. And so you can kind of see, and if the state library has master or the print negatives, it will be listed. If we have the microfilm, it'll be listed there. You are also welcome to, like, if you can't find anything, if you're having trouble with that, like, you can contact me, Nicole, or Gail, and we can sort of help answer some questions about that and make sure that you know make sure you're able to find what you're looking for.
Yeah, I mean, Jake's question also relates, I think, to sort of locality. He's talking about a Jewish paper that was a statewide paper, basically, rather than just based in a particular locality. So the search function, it seems like is very based around locality for the LibGuide that you've got there. So I think that was sort of also his question,
Sure.
how to think about kind of like the range of the paper, the reach of the paper.
Jake, you should contact us directly, because I think we have some background knowledge on some of the Jewish papers that we might be able to help you hunt down that information.
Sorry, Amherst, if I could just say something very quickly before the next question. Something that was kind of occurring to me as we were talking about sort of there are a lot of technical details involved in digitizing newspapers. And I think one thing that we've talked about a lot today is sort of how to work with vendors. And I just wanted to kind of emphasize the point that we don't really recommend that you try to scan in-house or digitize in-house. I think with newspapers, especially, the value of digitization comes from being able to search them. So you want the OCR to be as good as possible. And you're probably not going to be able to get those results working with equipment that you have within your library, whether that's like a microfilm reader or sort of a flatbed scanner or something like that. Like, that's just not going to give you the same results as working with a vendor. And working with vendors is also really helpful because they have a ton of experience. They've done a million of these projects. And especially if you are working at sort of a small institution, you don't have a lot of staff, you don't have a lot of expertise in this area. And you might be thinking to yourself, how on earth are we going to be able to do this type of project? If you're working with a reputable vendor, they can do so much for you as part of that. And be a really great resource for you. So that really reduces the amount of technical expertise that you actually have to have within your own institution. And we are, of course, always available to answer questions. And I actually just saw a question from Carol: is there a list of reputable vendors? So we at the State Library can't recommend vendors because we're a government agency. What we do have is we have a list of vendors that we know of who provide newspaper digitization services. So if any vendor contacts us and says, hey, we provide this service, we will add their name to the list. But that is at least could be a starting point for you. And I'm very happy to share that with you if you send me an email.
Yeah, that would be a great list that we would like to share with folks maybe after the fact. And one of the things the League is trying to do is develop some of these resource lists around, like, vendors, contractors, et cetera. So if you have a story of a vendor that you've worked with, you were really pleased with, please send it to Emily. You can reach her at emily@clho.org, and she'll be starting to assemble some of these lists for us. So we'd love to hear from you, because I think word of mouth and recommendation is another really good way to get those ideas.
Maybe some vendors would like to be at the annual conference too with a booth, and you can sell a booth to them.
Exactly, exactly. There were a few questions about OCR, optical character recognition, and what is sort of frustrations with the quality of OCR that's provided. What are the best practices around cleaning that up? Greg Colati jumped in to talk a little bit about what is sort of automatically done through the Tesseract program on content that's in CTDA. But I'm wondering if anyone else wants to share a little bit of advice around the OCR side. Like once you have the media file, is OCR a standard thing to get as a part of text digitization from a vendor? What kinds of services might you want to have in your contract around OCR? And are there other sort of, after the fact services that are also helpful if you want to have stuff cleaned up? Or is that something that people should really care about?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, that's one of the things that you would want to ask about in specifications with the vendor. So I saw someone mention that they had terrible OCR. So there are some vendors that's probably one way that they, I hate to say cut corners, but to give you a lower price, they may not be as diligent with their OCR. But it also could be, as Mike pointed out, poor microfilm is going to lead to poor OCR. If your page quality, if you're, you got a lot of blurry pages, that is definitely going to lend itself. So that's just something to think about. But ultimately, like, you have to look at your reels as a whole. Do you have a few pages on there that are blurry, and those pages are going to have poor OCR? Or is it your entire reel you're dealing with blurry pages? If you have the paper originals, in that case, it might be better to go with them if text searching capability is super important, you feel like, for your users. Anna might be able to talk more about if you ended up with bad OCR, how you can mitigate that, other than what the solution that CTDA offers.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's possible to acquire some OCR software on your own and try to run things through. But if you're planning to put your files into the CTDA, they, like Greg, I think, had commented, I don't know if he wants to unmute and just share a little bit about this, but the CTDA does have OCR software that's running that's very good.
Yeah, we use the Tesseract program, which is an industry standard, and it does as good a job as anything else. Anytime anything that's ingested with text is automatically OCR'd using this, and so the results, like I say, are based on the quality of the original. Like black and white microfilm, not so good. Blurry microfilm, not so good. Originals, much better. But then, as I said earlier, there are costs in scanning from the original. But in any case, scanning from the original always gets you better quality than scanning from a generation or two past the derivative. I mean, if you're really obsessive about this, you can send this out for double key data entry and you get what they call 5 nines, 99.999% accuracy. It's really expensive. They charge you by the keystroke, but it'll be perfect. And I think what you have to figure is, like, how much is good enough, right? Most people who search newspapers are searching for names or places or events. And so it doesn't matter if the word, I don't know, some words are not OCR'd well. Of course, the problem is most OCR has more trouble with names and places that are unusual. So it's,
Yeah,
It
I mean,
is-
if I
yeah.
can jump in here,
No,
Diane
please.
was sort of following up with the question, like if you have volunteers who want to edit the OCR, I mean, there's nothing stopping you from
Yeah.
doing that. But I think, Greg's point about, and actually everyone here's point about thinking about how necessary it is to have really good OCR. Like, I assume that most people are probably, the main use for the OCR is to keyword search and to be able to find articles related to a subject that someone's interested in researching, not because they want to grab full perfect text of the entire newspaper, right? So I think really thinking carefully about, because it's expensive to do that cleanup, either in dollars or in volunteer hours, who could be, volunteers could be doing something else at your organization that actually might be more important for, serving the public, bringing in visitors. I would suggest that people think carefully about how much time they want to spend on getting really great OCR. I think good enough in this situation, good enough to get people to find the stuff that they need to access, get them to the right article, get them to the right page of the newspaper. That's probably what you need. And if you have, don't forget that newspapers also have indexes too. And if you have an index for your newspaper, that's an important thing that researchers are probably going to want as well, for finding subjects in the newspaper. So I guess I just wanted to dive in there and just say, like, don't spend too much time on like making OCR perfect, I would say.
And going off of that, to bounce off of that, even Library of Congress does not require us to have perfect OCR. They just want OCR, like present. So they even Library of Congress, who's kind of, I feel like, one of the leading libraries in the country doing these large scale digitization projects, recognizes that OCR is not perfect unless you put a lot of time, a lot of money into it. And that's not, then goal is accessibility and preserving the papers digitally. And, obviously offering more searchability than is capable on microfilm and print copies.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. I have a few more questions that have I know we're a little over time, but I think getting to some of these last questions will be quite important. So Kate from Colchester had a sort of basic question about what to do, like what is the process? How safe is it to go from bound newspaper originals to digital? How would a vendor handle those? Are they able to handle them? What does that process look like? Or would they lose the original paper in the process? Is it destructive of the bound volumes?
So I'm actually an archivist by trade. So it makes me happy to see these questions and that you guys are thinking of those sort of things. So based on hopefully your newspapers are bound with a method that used like the string, they had holes in the paper and they strung them together and then put the binding over them. Hopefully they're not glued into the binding. Even if they are glued into the binding, that's not the end of the world. But basically, first you'll need to see how your binding is done, and then that's going to dictate how it's taken apart. If you got the kind of string, lace and string, you'll be able to cut that and separate things. If it's glued, it depends on how how the thickness of the glue. Are you going to have to slice? Are you going to be able to pull apart? That's a discussion to have with your vendor. You ultimately get to make the choice. Are you going to unbind them yourselves? Are you going to have the vendor do it? And if you have them do it, just ask those questions. You can unbind newspapers and they still come away usable. They should not be destroyed by being unbound. You might lose some of the page size. They're going to, obviously get handled a lot. So that's sort of things to think about, but they shouldn't get completely destroyed in being unbound. If you have really fragile, brittle newspaper, that's something you want to think about too. You might want to, if you don't have a staff person who is trained in preservation, conservation, handling, you might want to look at bringing someone in who could help you unbind them in-house if you're not confident that your vendor has that expertise either. But you shouldn't have to lose the physical copies to digitize, unless you're thinking like we're not going to keep them anyway. But I would think if you're asking this question, you do want to keep them. You don't want to lose them. So they don't have to be lost to digitization, but it is going to wear. It is going to wear on them some. And then you have to make the decision afterwards. Are you going to rebind them, or then are you going to store them flat in archival boxes? So that's something to think about too. How are you going to handle them after they're digitized and unbound?
And, if I could add there, I mean, this is kind of a question, I guess, not being familiar with this myself, but I would expect that a reputable vendor would be qualified to take care, that if you were working with a vendor who had done this sort of thing before, they would be prepared to kind of like do that work.
That expectation is fair. Make sure that
Yeah, okay.
they are, because it's not, unfortunately, sometimes vendors do damage materials. So just make sure, just check with them. And that's a case where having their reference list is really helpful. If they can point you to a previous client who digitized from print, you could go ask that client, how did they handle your materials? Did you have any damage? Was everything usable when it came back to you?
Great, thank you. Are there just two more questions I want to cover here before we get going? Although Elizabeth from Bridgeport History Center is adding that she's found that vendors often charge a disbanding fee per volume if you're working with bound materials. So that's important to know. The one question relates to how people should be storing and caring for their microfilm sort of in the meantime. And I think this goes back to some of the things that you were saying about acetate and deterioration. Verna had asked, I want to get her question exactly right here.
I see it. Yeah, I
Our
see it.
individual boxes of microfilm are stored in archival boxes. Can they be placed in plastic boxes to further protect them? Are there other ways that that small organizations in particular, like should be shoving their acetate in the fridge? Like what are some things that people should be doing?
So archival boxes are actually completely safe to store your film in, because they're typically pH neutral. So they're not going to off gas. They're not going to cause any reactions with the film. If you mean they're in a larger, like what we might call a document case, or maybe a flat box, there are individual boxes that you can get, like for one that fits one reel. That is a better option. There are plastic boxes that I believe are archival grade. They're not absolutely necessary. You can use the cardboard archival boxes. You get those from companies like, there are several supply companies, Gaylord, Hollinger, University Products, just to name a few. And typically the way our film is stored, our masters are in a plastic case that adheres to specifications from the Library of Congress when we did the Connecticut newspaper project, which was part of the larger US newspaper project. So there are specifications on the Library of Congress website, if you look up the US newspaper project, for storing microfilm. And also your reel base, like what the microfilm is wound around, is also a plastic piece, but you need to make sure it's archival grade so that your plastic is not off-gassing and causing further deterioration of your film. And then, yes, if you have acetate film, it's highly recommended to do the coldest storage you can. You don't necessarily, unless they're actively breaking down, like starting to really like crack, you don't necessarily need to freeze them because there's a whole host of things you have to do if you're going to freeze things as well. But you do want to keep them cold, and you want to just, when you're changing the temperature, so if you're taking them out of a very cold room and going into a room that's warmer, you need to do that gradually and give the item time to adjust, because the temperature and humidity changes are what can really cause the damage. So archival boxes are protecting your items, but if you're worried because you've got multiple reels of film in like one box, there are individual film size boxes that you can be using. So yeah.
But maybe don't throw it in the fridge.
Yeah, I wouldn't throw it in the fridge unless it's actively deteriorating, and then you don't throw it straight into the fridge. You need to basically have it in an enclosure with a couple different layers, because think about when you put food in the fridge or the freezer, you don't just leave it open, you have it enclosed, because you want to help with condensation, things like that. Look at the Northeast Document Conservation Center, might have some good resources for this, and you can also reach out to them at no charge to ask basic questions like that. So they might be a good place to start if you feel that if you are not sure if you need fridge or freezer storage. You could check with them. start there, and they can point you towards resources or give you advice and be like, yes, you need to get that into a freezer ASAP. So yeah.
Great, thank you. So there was also a really important question, which is just basically like, can you offer a ballpark cost for like how much digitizing a short run of newspaper might, I'm sure this is like highly variable, but what's a sort of like range for, the sticker price for something like this for an organization?
What do you think? Do you guys, should we give do you want to like just a range estimate per page, or do you think we should give like what do you
Maybe
guys
that's
think?
more useful.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I think you can expect to see quotes anywhere between 35 cents to maybe 55 cents a page is common if you're digitizing from film. If you're digitizing originals, if you're seeing quotes as low as 35 cents a page, that might be a bit of a red flag. You should expect to see a little bit higher, and it could go up to $1 per page, maybe even more. I will say it has been, in the past couple of years, I have not gotten a quote from a print page, just because I've been working on this project and we work with microfilm. But as you can see, it could easily double if you're doing print versus microfilm. And so, yeah, so for a small project, I mean, you could be looking at a few $1,000s. You also have to think about your technology needs. Like, do you have all the technology that you're going to need to deal with the files once you have them? Even if you're going to utilize Newspapers of Connecticut and have assistants putting things into the digital repository like CTDA, you might want to review the files yourself. You might want to, have local access to the files like on your servers, just for like in-house use. So you need to make sure that you have, you work in the cost for the technology for that as well. Anna, Gail, is there
That's good.
anything else?
Yeah, I think we can share, because it's a public contract that we have through the state. We currently pay 35 cents a page to digitize our newspaper microfilm for the Connecticut Digital Newspaper Project. That does also include, we have very specific metadata specifications that need to be followed. So that does include that as well. So there's the potential that it could be lower if you don't need as much metadata work. You don't need, like, we have to have a bunch of different types of files created too. So if you don't need that, could be cheaper as well.
And like Greg said, if the vendor's charging you extra for OCR, that's something you want to look out for. You may not need it if you're going to utilize CTDA. So that's another way to keep your cost a little bit lower. So, but yes, that's the pricing we're using. And so then you can multiply that by roughly how many pages you think you'll have. You're looking at if you're doing a small run, a couple to a few $1,000s is reasonable, I think.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I mean, we haven't even really talked about metadata. That's like a whole nother colleague circle, I think. So we'll put that on the calendar. I think those were all the questions that were in the chat. I think Ed from Rocky Hill wanted to ask a question live. You still here, Ed?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much. Lots of great information. They say timing is everything. We just had 33 rolls of microfilm digitized using with our Cora J. Belden Library. They had 63 rolls and they had already done 10. And so we collaborated with them to do 33 more. Weathersfield Post, the Rocky Hill Post, and the Rocky Hill Life from 1969 to 2007. I just want to say we used Charter Oak scanning and it cost us $60 per roll. I don't know if that's reasonable, but that's what it was. And the library had done the research on that. But I wanted to just tell you the process of what I think we're going to do with it, because we don't want to go down the copyright rabbit hole. I was considering, we keep a lot of all of our stuff on Google Drive, right? So those are uploaded to Google Drive now, and people, that come into the library or come into Academy Hall Museum can have access to that. So, but I wanted to put on our website under library holdings, at least a notification that we have these. And if you want to come into the museum to view them, then that's fine. So are there pitfalls in that? Does that sound kosher?
Anna, I don't know, Anna, Gail, if you want to, this is one of the areas we're limited in how we can respond because we're not allowed to give legal advice. I think not disseminating it publicly certainly cuts down your risk. I think it's safe to say that, for me to say that. So I would say you could think about letting the publishers know that you've done this work and see how they react to, some newspaper publishers are very happy to see digitization happen because they don't have the means to make older issues available. So a lot of times they're willing to work with organizations because they want the paper to be available as well. They still want it to be used. So that definitely cuts down on risk if it's not usable over the internet outside of your repository, for sure.
Yeah, because presumably that's very similar to just coming in and accessing it on site as you would on a microfilm reader.
Yes.
It's just in a different format.
Because you're
right?
just
Right.
providing access. Yeah, you're not, if people can't download it,
No.
yeah. So if you're just providing access, another means to view it, yeah.
Well, the
That-
Rocky Hill Post and the Weathersfield Post, they don't exist anymore. So how could I get in touch with the publisher,
Yeah.
right?
So yeah, so if they don't exist, if they didn't sell their remaining ownership to another publisher, then yes, that's considered kind of like an orphaned work. So that, yes, that's a different circumstance. But since, research use does go under the fair use clause of the Copyright Act, which I'm sure libraries are all familiar with. So there's that. If you're providing research access within your institution, that's low risk.
Okay.
And it puts it on the user, on the researcher, if they
Yes.
want to, quote or, reproduce or anything from
Yes.
that, then they have to do their due diligence. It's not on you, it's on them.
Yes, exactly.
I don't want to put him too much on the spot, but Mike Kamizis is here. He is manager of partnerships and projects at Connecticut Humanities now, but I know he's done a lot of thinking about copyright when he was at the CTDA as their repository manager. I don't know if there's anything you want to add here, or if you just want to offer if people can contact you, because I know you did a lot of work thinking about copyright issues for CTDA.
Right. So part of my job here is to put people into contact with the people who are in the know, and Nicole would be the person to contact about newspaper copyright, because it is different for published works. I've been working with Anna on a conversion project about the state publications. Archival collections are different depending, and I know in the CTDA, and I will share a link, we do have a tool to help you figure out what rights statements to use, and that's how we kind of talk about that. Like, a rights statement is something you apply. A Creative Commons license, which usually doesn't apply in this instance, is something you would apply as well. They're not binding. For example, you can say something is in copyright even if it's not, or you can make a mistake. It's not, someone can't come after you and said you did it wrong. It's just your best educated guess after your research, so you allow for more reuse. This kind of slots into the idea, and I'm going to talk to Nicole about this, about how do we get a group together to talk about this with special expertise in copyright about different things to do with archives and libraries. But yeah, copyright is, I don't view it as, it's not a negative, it is a journey. It is really interesting, and you'll find out a whole bunch of stuff. And then you too will become an expert to help other institutions, because I'm sure you'll cover all of these things. So yeah, I'm happy. I'll share my email. I'll share a link to the CTDA kind of resource guide that is currently available, and some resources there as well, kind of high general for GLAM institutions, galleries, libraries, archives, and museums as well. I'll put that in the chat.
Great, thanks, Mike. Thank you all for sticking with us so long. This has been really informative. Thank you so much, and especially thanks to Mike for organizing. Thanks to Connecticut Humanities and the CTDA for their cooperation. And thanks especially to the Connecticut State Library and the Connecticut Digital Newspaper Project, and to Gail, Nicole, and Anna for sharing their expertise and knowledge and all this wonderful information about the project. You can expect a follow-up email from CLHO with some of the resources that they've shared, as well as some of the things that have come up in our conversation. And we hope to see you again at another CLHO program. Have a great afternoon, everyone.